Instructor Moran stretched his 6 arms in what he considered a magnificent display of Zephyrian superiority, his purple-scaled hide gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights of Combat Hall 7, the Galactic Combat Academy's most prestigious training facility, if you could call a sterile metal box with scorch marks prestigious, buzzed with the chatter of 24 alien species pretending to pay attention. "Now class," Moran began, his voice carrying that special tone reserved for explaining things to particularly dim children. "Today we shall examine the combat capabilities of various species across the galaxy." He paused dramatically, savoring the moment like a fine Alterian wine, and by examine I mean laugh at how pathetically weak some of them are. The mixed collection of students, Corthans with their rock-hard exoskeletons, Vilaxians whose tentacles could crush steel, and a few other supposedly impressive species, shifted in their seats with anticipation. They knew what was coming. Everyone did. Take, for instance, the so-called humans from that little blue mud ball called Earth. Moran's 4 eyes practically sparkled with malicious glee. Soft pink skin that tears like wet paper, bones so fragile they break from minor impacts, and reflexes slower than a sedated glump slug. A ripple of laughter spread through the classroom because apparently mocking an entire species never got old around here. The instructor's chest puffed out with pride, his secondary breathing vents flaring like a peacock showing off its plumage. In the back corner, Amy Kowalski sat perfectly still, her brown eyes fixed on her datapad with the kind of focus that suggested she was either taking very detailed notes or planning 17 different ways to commit justifiable homicide. Her short blonde hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her standard-issue academy uniform looked somehow more professional on her than on anyone else in the room. "Oh look," Moran continued, having spotted his favorite target, "we actually have one of these delicate earth flowers with us today. Miss Kowalski, would you care to defend your species' supposed combat prowess?" Amy glanced up briefly, her expression as neutral as Switzerland during a galactic war. "I'm here to learn, Instructor Moran," she said quietly, her voice carrying just enough politeness to technically qualify as respectful. "How wonderfully modest," Moran sneered, his mandibles clicking together in what passed for a smirk among his kind. "Though I suppose modesty is all humans have left when faced with superior alien physiology." The other students chuckled appreciatively, because sucking up to the instructor was apparently a universal constant across all sentient species. A particularly ambitious Corthan student named Cortex actually slow-clapped, which was impressive considering his hands were basically living hammers. Moran basked in the attention like a lizard under a heat lamp. "In fact, class, I believe today would be perfect for a practical demonstration. Let us witness firsthand just how these weak humans fare against our trial of strength." He gestured grandly toward the far end of the training hall where a massive combat dummy stood like a monument to alien engineering excess. The thing was built like a fortress, reinforced durasteel core wrapped in impact-absorbing synthetic muscle, designed to withstand the kind of punishment that would turn a small building into rubble. Its surface gleamed with a metallic sheen that practically screamed, "I am completely indestructible, and your pathetic attacks amuse me." "This magnificent creation," Moran announced, stroking the dummy's surface with obvious affection, "is built to Zephyrian military specifications. It can absorb energy blasts that would vaporize a small asteroid, withstand kinetic impacts that would flatten a hover car, and remain completely undamaged through exercises that would hospitalize lesser species." The dummy stood 3 meters tall, roughly humanoid in shape but built like someone had decided to make a person out of tank armor. Various sensor nodes dotted its surface, ready to measure and record the laughably weak attempts of inferior species to cause even minor damage. "The challenge is simple," Moran continued, his voice dripping with condescension thicker than Aldebaran honey. "Strike the target with sufficient force to register on our damage sensors. Any species worth their place in this academy should manage at least a minor impact reading." He turned toward Amy with the kind of smile that suggested he was about to enjoy this way too much. "Miss Kowalski, since you represent humanity's finest, and by finest I mean only example in our academy, Would you care to demonstrate your species' legendary combat abilities? The entire classroom fell silent, waiting to see how spectacularly this was about to go wrong. Before Amy could respond, Cortex raised one of his massive stone-like appendages, his voice rumbling like gravel in a cement mixer. Instructor Moran, perhaps we should warn her about the medical bay first. I heard human bones snap easier than Regalian breadsticks. Oh please, chimed in Vylon, a serpentine creature, whose scales shifted colors with amusement, currently cycling through what could only be described as smug rainbow. I once saw a human trip over their own feet and require 3 days of recovery. They probably need safety padding just to walk. Cathara, a multi-eyed insectoid whose mandibles clicked with barely contained laughter, added her own observation. My cousin works in the diplomatic corps and says humans require special temperature controls, specific atmospheric pressure, and regular consumption of heated plant liquids just to function. How adorable. The class erupted in what passed for laughter among 24 different species, creating a sound like a malfunctioning universal translator having an existential crisis. Moran preened under the attention, his ego expanding faster than a gas giant in a solar flare. Now, students, he said with fake concern, we must be considerate of our fragile guest. Perhaps Miss Kowalski would prefer to observe from a safe distance while I demonstrate proper technique. Without waiting for an answer, Moran strode toward the weapon rack with the confidence of someone who had clearly never experienced actual consequences for his actions. He selected a standard-issue plasma rifle, the kind designed for mid-level combat scenarios, and hefted it with practiced ease. Watch carefully, class. This is how a properly evolved species handles advanced weaponry. He took aim at the combat dummy, his 4 arms providing what he assumed was superior stability, and fired. The plasma bolt struck the target with a satisfying crack of energy, leaving a tiny scorch mark roughly the size of a coin on the dummy's reinforced surface. Excellent, Moran announced, despite the fact that his excellent shot had accomplished roughly the same damage as an angry bee. As you can see, proper Zephyrian technique achieves measurable results. The damage sensors displayed a reading so pathetically low that the computer seemed embarrassed to show it, but Moran acted as if he had just split an atom with his bare hands. Now then, he continued, turning toward the 2 humans with the expression of someone about to enjoy a particularly entertaining execution, who would like to attempt this advanced combat technique. Brandon Torres, the other human exchange student, stood up with the kind of resigned determination usually reserved for soldiers volunteering for suicide missions. His dark hair was cropped short in military fashion, and his olive complexion had taken on a slightly green tinge that suggested he knew exactly how this was going to end. I'll give it a shot, sir, Brandon said, his voice steady despite what was obviously a complete lack of confidence in the outcome. How brave, Cathara whispered loudly enough for the entire class to hear. Like watching a small mammal challenge a hover tank. Brandon took the plasma rifle from Moran, his human hands looking almost comically small compared to the instructor's 6-limbed grip. He raised the weapon, took careful aim, and fired. The plasma bolts sailed wide, missing the target entirely and leaving a black mark on the wall that would probably require explaining to the maintenance department later. The classroom exploded with alien laughter that ranged from Cortex's boulder-grinding guffaws to Vylon's high-pitched hissing that sounded like steam escaping from a damaged pipe. Even the usually stoic Carathians were making the rumbling sounds that passed for amusement in their culture. Did you see that? Cortex wheezed between laughs. He missed a target the size of a transport shuttle from 10 meters away. Those fragile earth bones probably shattered from the weapon's recoil, Vylon added, wiping tears from several of his eyes simultaneously. I bet their pathetic human reflexes made him flinch, Cathara contributed. Their nervous systems are probably too primitive to handle advanced technology. Brandon's face flushed red with embarrassment as he handed the weapon back to Moran, who accepted it with the air of someone retrieving a valuable item from a small child who had been playing with it inappropriately. Class, this is exactly what I was talking about, Moran announced, gesturing toward Brandon, like he was a particularly interesting specimen in a biology lab. Humans simply lack the physical coordination, mental processing speed, and evolutionary development necessary for serious combat applications. Throughout this entire display, Amy remained perfectly still in her corner seat, her brown eyes moving methodically between the target, the weapons rack, and the various alien students who were still chuckling at Brandon's expense. She took notes on her datapad with the kind of quiet efficiency that suggested she was cataloging more than just academic observations. Moran, riding high on his wave of superiority, decided this was the perfect moment to deliver his coup de grace. "You know, Miss Kowalski," he said, his voice dripping with condescension so thick it could probably be bottled and sold as industrial lubricant, "perhaps humans should stick to serving our meals instead of attempting combat training. I hear your species has quite talented hands for food preparation and cleaning duties." The classroom fell silent again, but this time the silence had a different quality to it. Even some of the alien students seemed to recognize that Moran had just crossed a line from educational mockery into something considerably more insulting. Amy looked up from her datapad, her expression still perfectly neutral, and said quietly, "That's an interesting perspective, Instructor." Something in her tone made Moran's victories smile falter slightly, though he was too busy basking in his own brilliance to pay proper attention to warning signs. Amy closed her datapad with a soft click that somehow managed to cut through the lingering chuckles of the alien students. She stood up slowly, her movements precise and controlled, like someone who had made a decision that couldn't be unmade. "Instructor Moran," she said politely, her voice carrying the kind of calm that usually preceded either enlightenment or catastrophe, "I'd like to try the trial myself if that's acceptable." The classroom erupted in laughter so intense that several species began making sounds that probably violated noise ordinances on civilized planets. Cortex laughed so hard his rocky exterior actually cracked in a few places, while Vylon's color-shifting scales cycled through what appeared to be the entire spectrum of hilarity. Kithara's compound eyes watered with mirth as her mandibles clicked in rapid succession. "Oh, this is rich," Cortex managed between boulder-grinding guffaws. "The little pink mammal wants to try after watching her friend miss a target the size of a cargo hauler." "Someone record this," Vylon wheezed, wiping tears from multiple eyes. "My clutch siblings will never believe a human actually volunteered for public humiliation." Moran's ego practically swelled to the size of a small moon. Here was the perfect opportunity to demonstrate once and for all the vast superiority of evolved alien species over these primitive Earth creatures. "Of course, Miss Kowalski," he said with the magnanimous tone of an emperor granting an audience to a particularly amusing peasant. "I admire your courage, misguided though it may be." Amy walked toward the weapons rack with measured steps, ignoring the renewed laughter from her classmates. But instead of reaching for any of the advanced energy weapons or kinetic projectile systems, she stopped and turned back toward Moran. "Actually, sir, I was wondering if I might use my own equipment. I brought something from Earth for cultural exchange purposes." The laughter died down as confusion replaced amusement. Moran's 4 eyes blinked in sequence, like a malfunctioning display screen. "Your own equipment?" he repeated, his voice carrying the tone of someone who suspected he was being pranked but couldn't figure out how. Amy reached into her personal storage locker and withdrew what appeared to be a primitive wooden staff curved at both ends, with a thin string connecting them. She also produced a single, slender wooden shaft, with feathers attached to one end and a sharp metal point at the other. The silence that followed was the kind usually reserved for moments when everyone in the room simultaneously realized they had made a terrible mistake, but couldn't quite identify what it was yet. "Is that," Vylon said slowly, his scales shifting to confused purple, "a stick?" "It's a bow," Amy said simply, testing the string's tension with practiced ease. "And this is an arrow. Traditional Earth hunting equipment." The laughter that erupted this time was so intense it probably registered on seismic equipment in neighboring star systems. Even students from species known for their stoic nature were making sounds that suggested they had found religion, and that religion was comedy. "A stick and string," Kithara gasped, between fits of mandible clicking. She wants to fight advanced alien technology with a stick and string. Oh, my ancestors, Cortex rumbled. This is even better than I hoped. She's going to attack a military-grade combat dummy with museum artifacts. At that precise moment, the training hall's main doors hissed open and Commander Tom Marley strode in, his uniform crisp and his expression suggesting he had heard the commotion from 3 floors away. The human commander's presence immediately caused the alien students to attempt looking slightly less like they were attending a comedy show. "Instructor Moran," Marley said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Care to explain why Combat Hall 7 sounds like a circus?" "Ah, Commander Marley," Moran said, his confidence returning as he saw another opportunity to showcase human inferiority to a ranking officer. "We're conducting a practical demonstration of species combat capabilities. Miss Kowalski has volunteered to attempt our trial of strength using primitive Earth weaponry." Marley's eyes moved from Moran to Amy's bow, then to the combat dummy, and finally to the collection of alien students who were trying very hard not to burst into laughter again. His expression remained carefully neutral, but something that might have been interest flickered in his eyes. "Carry on," he said, taking a position where he could observe clearly. This should be educational. As Amy moved into position, alien students began placing bets on just how spectacularly this was about to fail, their voices creating a buzz of anticipation that filled the training hall like the hum of an overcharged reactor about to experience a very expensive malfunction. Amy positioned herself exactly 15 meters from the combat dummy, then began what could only be described as the most methodical preparation ritual anyone in the academy had ever witnessed. She held up one hand, feeling for air currents that were barely detectable in the climate-controlled environment, her eyes scanning the space between herself and the target with the intensity of someone mapping a minefield. "Look at this," Cortex whispered loudly, his voice carrying the kind of amusement reserved for watching small children pretend to be adults. "She's checking for wind in a sealed training facility. Maybe humans need special atmospheric conditions to function properly," Vylon suggested, his scales cycling through amused yellow. "Like those plants that only bloom under specific star alignments." Amy ignored the commentary completely, measuring the distance with careful steps, examining the lighting angles, and testing her bowstring tension with small, precise movements. To the alien students, it looked like an elaborate religious ceremony performed by someone who had forgotten what century they lived in. What they couldn't see were the memories flooding through her mind. Weekend mornings in the Montana wilderness, with her grandfather, a weathered man whose hands could place an arrow in a target smaller than a coin at distances that made other hunters question the laws of physics. State championships, where she'd competed against electronic sighting systems with nothing but instinct and years of practice. The University of Montana Archery team, where she'd earned the nickname Bullseye for reasons that had nothing to do with luck. "Commander Marley," Moran said, his voice dripping with the confidence of someone about to deliver a masterpiece of educational humiliation. "You're about to witness the fundamental difference between evolved alien physiology and primitive human limitations." He gestured grandly toward Amy, who was now examining her arrow with the kind of attention usually reserved for diffusing explosive devices. "Notice how she requires elaborate preparation rituals for what should be a simple kinetic projection. This is because human neural processing operates at roughly 1/10 the speed of proper Zephyrian cognitive function." "Is she praying to it?" Kethera wondered aloud, watching Amy run her fingers along the arrow shaft. "Maybe humans believe their tools have spirits. Primitive species often develop superstitious attachments to their equipment," Moran explained with professorial authority. "It's a psychological compensation mechanism for their physical inadequacy." Commander Marley watched silently, his expression unreadable, but his eyes tracked every detail of Amy's preparation, with the attention of someone who had learned not to dismiss things simply because they looked unfamiliar. Amy knocked the arrow with a fluid motion that spoke of thousands of hours of practice, the wooden shaft settling against the bowstring with a soft whisper that somehow cut through the alien chatter. Her stance shifted into perfect form, feet positioned with mathematical precision, shoulders aligned, drawing arms steady as granite. The training hall gradually fell quiet as even the most skeptical alien students began to notice something they couldn't quite identify. Amy's entire posture radiated a kind of focused competence that didn't match their expectations of primitive human bumbling. Remarkable muscle control for such a fragile species, Moran observed, though his voice had lost some of its earlier smugness. Though of course proper form means nothing without adequate strength and neural coordination. Amy drew the bowstring back with smooth controlled power, the wooden bow bending in a perfect arc that demonstrated engineering principles the aliens assumed humans hadn't discovered yet. The arrow point aimed toward the combat dummy with unwavering steadiness, and for the first time since the demonstration began, the training hall achieved something approaching actual silence. Even Commander Marley leaned forward slightly, his military instincts recognizing the presence of genuine skill even when delivered through unfamiliar methods. The moment stretched like the drawn bowstring, tension building toward what everyone assumed would be an anticlimactic conclusion to an entertaining afternoon of human inadequacy. Amy's breathing slowed to the rhythm of someone entering a meditative state that transcended the chaos of alien mockery around her. Her brown eyes narrowed with laser-like focus on a point precisely 17 centimeters below the combat dummy's center mass, where structural engineering met the immutable laws of physics in ways that alien military designers had apparently never considered. Time seemed to dilate as her fingers found the release point that existed somewhere between conscious thought and muscle memory. The bowstring, under approximately 47 pounds of carefully controlled tension, waited for the precise microsecond when every variable aligned into perfect harmony. Her back muscles engaged with the fluid precision of a finely tuned machine, her drawing arm moving with the kind of controlled power that spoke of countless hours perfecting an art form that predated most galactic civilizations. The arrow, a simple wooden shaft that probably cost less than a single energy cell for the plasma rifles, rested against her knuckle like it had found its true home. And then she released. The bowstring snapped forward with a sound like controlled lightning, transferring every joule of stored energy into the arrow with an efficiency that would have impressed physics professors across the galaxy. The wooden projectile leaped from the bow with a velocity that made several alien students blink in surprise at the sharp whistle of displaced air. What happened next defied every assumption the assembled aliens had made about primitive Earth technology, human physical capabilities, and the fundamental nature of reality itself. The arrow flew in a perfectly straight line, its fletching stabilizing the flight path with aerodynamic precision that engineers would have needed computers to calculate. No wobble, no deviation, no hint of the amateur incompetence everyone expected from a member of such a primitively evolved species. Cortex opened his mouth to make another joke about human inadequacy, but the words died in his throat as he watched the projectile maintain its trajectory with mechanical perfection. Vylon's scales shifted to confused purple as his brain struggled to process what his eyes were reporting. Cathera's compound eyes tracked the arrow's flight with the horrified fascination of someone watching their worldview approach a catastrophic collision with reality. The arrow struck the combat dummy exactly where Amy had aimed, the metal point making contact with the reinforced durasteel surface at a speed that turned kinetic energy into something approaching divine intervention. For one perfect instant the training hall existed in a state of suspended disbelief. The combat dummy, designed to absorb plasma blasts that could vaporize small asteroids and kinetic impacts that could flatten hover cars, encountered a force it had never been engineered to handle, precise application of physics by someone who actually understood how they worked. Crack. The sound echoed through Combat Hall 7, like the universe itself had just snapped in half. The reinforced combat dummy, all 3 meters of military-grade engineering excellence, split completely down the middle with a sound that would haunt alien nightmares for generations to come. The two halves of what had been an indestructible target tilted away from each other and crashed to the floor with impacts that registered on vibration sensors 3 floors away. The silence that followed was so complete it achieved a quality approaching religious experience. Not a single alien student moved, breathed, or made any sound that might disturb the profound cosmic wrongness of what they had just witnessed. Even the training facility's environmental system seemed to pause in respectful acknowledgement of the impossible thing that had just occurred. Instructor Moran's jaw, all 4 sections of it, dropped open so wide that small objects could have fallen in and been lost forever. His 6 arms hung limp at his sides like someone had disconnected the neural pathways between his brain and his motor functions. His 4 eyes stared at the ruins of the combat dummy with the expression of someone whose entire understanding of the universe had just been fed into a matter shredder. Commander Marley's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline with the measured precision of someone watching established laws of physics submit formal resignation letters. The combat dummy, which moments before had stood as a monument to alien engineering superiority, now lay in 2 perfectly symmetrical pieces that would require extensive explanation to the Academy's insurance department. The damage sensors, designed to measure and record impacts from advanced alien weaponry, had registered readings that made the computer systems question their own programming. Amy lowered her bow with the same calm precision she had used for everything else, her expression showing about as much emotion as someone who had just successfully completed a routine maintenance procedure. She reached up to tuck a loose strand of blonde hair behind her ear, a gesture so casually human that it somehow made the destruction behind her even more surreal. The training hall remained locked in stunned silence, 24 alien students and 2 instructors struggling to process the fact that their fundamental assumptions about reality had just been split in half by a piece of carved wood and a length of string operated by someone from a species they had dismissed as evolutionary failures. Somewhere in the distance, a maintenance alert began chiming softly, requesting immediate attention for what the computer diplomatically classified as unexpected structural damage to training equipment. The stunned silence stretched for approximately 17 seconds before alien brains began frantically attempting to process what their sensory organs were reporting. Cortex was the first to speak, his voice carrying the hollow tone of someone whose fundamental understanding of reality had just been fed through an industrial shredder. "That's impossible," he said, staring at the 2 halves of the combat dummy like they were artifacts from a parallel dimension. The structural integrity matrix alone should have dispersed the kinetic impact across the entire surface area. "Maybe the dummy was defective," Vylon suggested, his scales cycling through confused patterns that didn't exist in any known color spectrum. "Manufacturing error. Substandard materials. Something." Kithara's compound eyes were performing rapid calculations that made her head twitch in disturbing directions. The kinetic energy required to achieve structural failure at that specific point would need to exceed 17,000 pounds per square inch. That's mathematically impossible from a primitive projectile weapon. Amy walked calmly toward the ruined target, retrieved her arrow from the debris, and examined it for damage with the kind of casual attention someone might give to checking their watch. The arrow, having just accomplished what advanced alien weaponry couldn't manage, appeared completely unharmed. "How?" Brandon Torres whispered, his voice carrying the tone of someone who had just witnessed his own species achieve something that violated several laws of physics. Amy glanced up from her arrow inspection, her expression showing mild surprise that anyone was confused about basic mechanics. "Leverage, precision, and patience," she said simply, as if explaining why water was wet. The dummy was designed to absorb dispersed energy impacts, but kinetic force applied to a specific structural weakness creates different results. She gestured toward the split target with her arrow, her tone taking on the patient quality of someone explaining elementary concepts to bright children. "See where it's split? That's the junction point between the reinforced core and the impact absorption layer. Hit it precisely perpendicular with sufficient focused force, and the materials separate along their natural stress lines." The alien student stared at her like she had just casually announced that gravity was optional on Tuesdays. "But that's just engineering," Amy added with a slight shrug. "Back home, we call it knowing where to hit something." Instructor Moran, meanwhile, was experiencing what could only be described as the 5 stages of having one's superiority complex demolished by a piece of sharpened wood. He had progressed through denial and was now firmly entrenched in desperate bargaining with reality. "Obviously there was an equipment malfunction," he announced loudly, his voice carrying the forced confidence of someone trying to convince himself as much as his audience. The combat dummy must have had a structural defect. These things happen with mass-produced military equipment. He began circling the wreckage like a detective examining a crime scene, his 6 arms gesturing wildly as he searched for evidence to support his rapidly crumbling worldview. Yes, clearly a manufacturing error, probably faulty molecular bonding in the Durasteel matrix. We'll need to file a complaint with the supplier. Commander Marley stepped closer to examine the split target, his military training allowing him to recognize genuine tactical effectiveness, even when delivered through methods that challenged his preconceptions. Miss Kowalski, he said carefully, how did you identify the structural weakness? Amy looked slightly embarrassed by the attention. It's pretty obvious once you know what to look for, sir. The dummy's designed like most composite armor systems, with a hard core and flexible outer layer. The junction between different materials is always the weak point. Basic physics. Basic physics, Marley repeated slowly, his tone suggesting he was mentally revising several assumptions about human educational standards. At that moment the training hall's doors burst open as 3 additional instructors rushed in, apparently having heard either the crack of the splitting dummy or the alerts from the facility's monitoring systems. Instructor Thane, a massive Korathian whose rocky hide made him look like a walking mountain, led the group. What happened here? Thane rumbled, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to investigating training accidents. His eyes swept the room, taking in the destroyed target, the shocked students, and Amy standing calmly in the middle of it all, with a wooden bow. Training exercise, Commander Marley said simply. Miss Kowalski was demonstrating human combat techniques. Instructor Valara, a Thessian whose blue skin was currently displaying patterns of confused concern, approached the wreckage with the cautious steps of someone approaching an unexploded bomb. This is a Type 7 military dummy. They're rated to withstand direct hits from portable fusion weapons. Apparently not from wooden arrows, Marley observed dryly. The third instructor, Korvik, whose multiple tentacles were currently performing what appeared to be very agitated calculations in the air, turned toward Amy with something approaching reverence. How is this possible? Our engineers assured us these targets were virtually indestructible. Amy looked uncomfortable with the growing attention, her humble demeanor contrasting sharply with Moran's earlier preening arrogance. I really didn't do anything special, sir. Just applied basic principles about force distribution and structural engineering. Any decent archer could have managed the same shot. Any decent archer, Korvik repeated faintly. Moran, still desperately clinging to his narrative of equipment failure, began inspecting the dummy's remains with increasing desperation. There must be documentation of previous damage, stress fractures, something to explain this anomaly. Commander Marley watched Amy carefully as she shouldered her bow with practiced ease. Miss Kowalski, I'm beginning to think we may need to reassess our understanding of human combat capabilities. Oh, this isn't combat, sir, Amy said with genuine surprise. This is just target shooting. Combat archery is considerably more complex. The silence that greeted this statement suggested that several alien instructors were beginning to suspect they had made some very significant miscalculations about Earth's supposedly primitive species. By the time the afternoon training cycles ended, word of the impossible shot had spread through the Galactic Combat Academy faster than gossip at a diplomatic reception. The Academy's communication networks buzzed with increasingly exaggerated accounts of a human student destroying military-grade equipment with what amounted to a sharpened stick and some string. In the corridors between Combat Hall 7 and the dormitory sections, groups of alien students could be overheard having conversations that would have been unthinkable just hours earlier. I heard she split it completely in half, a Vilaxian whispered to his study group, his scales shifting between awe and disbelief. Clean down the middle, like it was made of crystallized sugar. My cousin was there, replied a Korthan, whose rocky exterior was practically vibrating with excitement. He said the instructors are calling emergency meetings about reassessing human combat potential. Someone told me she said it was just basic target practice, added a Thessian, her blue skin displaying patterns of confused respect. If that's their basic level, What exactly are their advanced techniques capable of? The most dramatic change, however, occurred in Combat Hall 7 itself during the next day's training session. Instead of the usual mockery and dismissive laughter that had greeted human students, Amy found herself surrounded by alien classmates whose attitudes had undergone a transformation that bordered on the miraculous. Cortex, whose previous comments about fragile human bones now seemed painfully inadequate, approached with the careful respect usually reserved for handling unstable explosives. "Miss Kowalski," he said, his voice carrying none of its former condescension, "would you perhaps be willing to explain the engineering principles you mentioned yesterday?" Violin slithered closer, his scales cycling through respectful green patterns. "The precision required for that shot? How does one develop such accuracy? Is this standard training for your species?" Even Cathara, whose compound eyes now tracked Amy's movements with something approaching scientific fascination, had abandoned her earlier crude jokes in favor of genuine curiosity. The mathematical calculations involved in identifying structural weak points. Is this knowledge common among Earth humans? Amy, still somewhat bewildered by the sudden shift in attention, found herself at the center of a learning circle that had spontaneously formed around her position. "Well," she said carefully, "archery is mostly about understanding basic physics and practicing consistent form. Anyone can learn it with enough patience." "Anyone?" Cortex repeated with the tone of someone who had just been offered the secrets of the universe. "Sure," Amy replied, reaching for her bow. "The principles are pretty straightforward. Would you like me to show you?" The alien students practically trampled each other in their eagerness to observe what they now recognized as advanced human combat techniques. The irony was not lost on Brandon Torres, who watched from across the training hall with a grin that threatened to permanently reshape his facial structure. Meanwhile, Instructor Moran was discovering that his colleagues had heard about his boastful comments regarding human inferiority, and their reactions were considerably less supportive than he had hoped. "So you told a room full of students that humans were only suitable for food service?" Instructor Thane rumbled, his rocky features arranged in what might charitably be called amusement. Right before one of them demonstrated superior tactical analysis and precision weapons handling. It was clearly an equipment malfunction, Moran insisted, though his voice lacked its former conviction. The dummy must have been compromised by previous training exercises. Valara ran a full structural analysis, Korvek interjected, his tentacles performing dismissive gestures. The target was in perfect condition. The human achieved genuine structural failure through precise application of kinetic force to a mathematically optimal impact point. In other words, Thane added with the kind of smile that made mountains nervous, she knew exactly what she was doing while you were busy explaining how primitive her species was. The final blow to Marine's wounded pride came when Academy administration announced that Amy Kowalski had been invited to conduct a special seminar on alternative kinetic weapon systems and precision targeting techniques for advanced combat students. Back in Combat Hall 7, Amy was patiently explaining bow mechanics to a group of alien students who hung on her every word with the devotion usually reserved for religious experiences. "The key is consistent form," she was saying, demonstrating the proper start. "Every shot needs to be exactly the same until it becomes automatic." Brandon Torres, meanwhile, was experiencing his own renaissance. Alien students who had previously treated him like an amusing pet were now approaching with questions about human tactics, Earth military history, and whether he possessed any similarly devastating skills they should know about. "The thing is," Amy continued, addressing her impromptu class, "humans have been developing projectile weapons for thousands of years. We've had a lot of time to figure out what works." The alien students exchanged glances that suggested they were beginning to understand that dismissing a species with thousands of years of weapons development experience might have been a miscalculation of galactic proportions. As the training session concluded, the Academy's perspective on primitive Earth weapons had shifted so dramatically that the procurement department was already researching suppliers for wooden training bows, apparently having decided that any weapon system capable of defeating their most advanced targets deserved serious study. The age of human underestimation at the Galactic Combat Academy had officially ended with the sound of splitting durasteel and the quiet confidence of a girl from Montana,